Our Conservative platform is full of real, concrete measures. We know how much it will cost and where the money is going to come from.
We know that with some of these investments, we're hoping, and we've seen that there's been a realization of savings as well.
Our blood, sweat, and tears has gone into making sure that we could number crunch some key promises.
Fully costed platform out, and we know that it's a real and serious plan.
Welcome back to Power and Politics. We're coming to you live from the headquarters of CBC here in Toronto as we prepare for election coverage. I want to welcome all of our viewers joining us on Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. Federal parties, as you've been hearing throughout the week, have laid out the key planks of their platforms and have explained, at least in part, how they're going to pay for it all. This week, we've been speaking to parties about their spending plans. Today, though, we're turning things over to you. What do you want to know about each of the parties' plan to spend your money? You can post your questions in the comment section on the CBC News YouTube channel, on our Facebook page, or on Twitter. The hashtag, you can send us a tweet anytime, is at PNPCBC. Now, joining us to answer all of these questions are two people who have graded each party's fiscal frameworks, Mustafa Askari and Kevin Page, from the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. They join us from our studios in Ottawa. And right here next to me in Toronto is CBC's senior business correspondent, Peter Armstrong. Hello to all three of you. Thank you for making time for all of us and for these questions. So I'm going to start off, Mr. Page, I'll begin with you. We've already got a ton of questions in from Instagram, and I apologize in advance to anyone listening if I mispronounce your name, because it's almost a guarantee that I will. At M. Sauerbray asks, which of the parties is on track to balance the budget?
Well, Vassy, there's really only one party that's committed to balance the budget. That's the Conservative Party. And it will take them 5 years, so they wouldn't do it to 2024-25. So in the meantime, we'll be running deficits, and the stock of debt will go up by roughly, about $80 billion-ish from where it stands right now, about $685 billion. But so only one party is really committed to balancing the books. The
Greens have also promised, the Greens have promised to do it in 5 years, but they've added the sort of caveat that they wouldn't, that if economic circumstances were to change, they're not married to that plan. Mr. Askari, let me ask you, if any party, Michaela Houghton asks, how will they reduce our national debt? Did any of the parties put forward a plan that would, that talks about reducing the debt?
Actually, again, none of the parties actually will reduce the debt over the next 4 years because they're all going to be running deficit over the next mandate. So the debt will increase under all the platforms, but different degrees, obviously. The Liberals have the highest increase in the debt level, and the Conservatives have the lowest increase in the debt level. And the difference between the two of them by the last year of the next mandate is about $40 billion.
Okay, Peter, I want to bring you in because you have a chart right here.
I always come armed with charts that I then can't show on TV, right? Well, it's interesting because, some of the economists that we often turn to for these kinds of things, Trevor Toome, Stephen Gordon, Lindsay Tedds, these economists that have done a really good job over the course, and our other guests as well, of course, that have done a really good job over the course of this campaign of instantly breaking down each of these campaign proposals. What do they mean? What do they look like? And offering up really simple, easy to digest charts to help us understand. And this is one of those that you can simply just look at. The Liberals would add $114 billion in debt between now and 2024, and the Conservatives would bring that down to about $73.7 billion, but they're adding to the debt too, right? We're not even going to get close to a balanced budget until at least 2024, and the Conservatives have come under fire for that because of questions around, specifically what you said the Greens will do, that they'll adjust if there's something in the economy. And for all the talk that we've had about the parties and their proposals and what it'll mean for the Canadian economy, and the Canadian economy is good, maybe not great, we are held hostage, really, to the international economy, to international growth. And as international trade is sort of seizing up, we need to be in a position to make sure that we can weather that no matter what happens, and that plans would be flexible regardless of what the economic landscape looks like a year from now or 2 years from now.
At Jauko Moda, Mr. Page asks just one simple question: how are they going to pay for all their campaign proposals? I know that that's a wide-ranging question, so maybe if you could, Mr. Page, highlight a couple of the things that stand out for you among the party's platforms as far as that question goes.
So there's to different degrees across the parties. They're proposing revenue increases. All the parties are proposing to have more enforcement, and so to generate additional revenues. One of the parties, and some of the parties like the Greens and the NDP are proposing quite significant increases in revenues through corporate taxes, wealth taxes, e-commerce taxes, changes to capital gains taxation. So there's definitely from the Greens and the NDP significant revenue increases. From the Conservatives, their focus to get back to balance is primarily on the spending side. Again, they're proposing to kind of close some tax loopholes as well, but there's some serious savings on spending, cutting back on infrastructure plan spending over the next 5 years, finding savings in personnel and other operations of government, savings in corporate subsidies, savings on the international envelope. And the Liberals, for the most part, they have some revenue generating measures as well. Again, they promise to find savings on tax expenditures, and again, those corporate tax loopholes. So again, there's different offerings out there. Some big fiscal expansions from the NDP and the Greens, so they have to raise more revenues, and the more modest proposals on the Conservative and Liberal side.
Mr. Ascari, let me jump in and ask you for a follow-up on that. As far as let me start with the revenue generation ideas. As I was studying for the various interviews with the parties this week, using the handy guide that your organization produced, as well as the current Parliamentary Budget Officer's assessment, I noticed that many of the assumptions that they made around revenue had a high degree of uncertainty. Especially, talk a bit, if you could, about, for example, the idea that they're going to close these tax loopholes and generate billions of dollars. Is that a sure bet?
Well, nothing is a sure bet when we are estimating over in the future. But some of these tax proposals, for example, taxing stock markets, essentially financial transactions, these are very, very uncertain, because we don't know exactly how investors are going to behave and respond to that. They can move their operations and transaction to other jurisdictions. So there's significant uncertainty attached to a number of tax measures that are proposed, especially by NDP and the Green Party. The tax reductions that the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party those are pretty easy to implement. There's really nothing, right? It just needs a legislation to implement. But a lot of tax revenue measures, certainly they're subject to a lot of uncertainty, and if they don't come and if they don't get those revenues, then there will be significant impact on the fiscal structure and on the deficit level as well.
Mr. Page and Mr. Ascari outlined the two various ways that they're going to pay for promises. It's either cut down on spending or raise new revenue. On the spending side of things, do you think the questions that critics of the Conservatives have raised around, for example, what's hidden in these cuts? Like, is this the full picture? What do you make of those?
It's interesting because it's almost like, from an academic perspective, I could argue it from both sides. And I think what gets lost in that is the Conservatives are actually increasing spending by like $32 billion between now and 2024. It's like an annual increase of 1.8% of government spending. And it's important to keep that in mind. They're going to change where we spend it. They're going to drop it down as we sort of gear out towards 2024, where they get to a balanced budget. But in those early years of the budget, they're increasing spending quite significantly. And I think, you and I have had this conversation before, and I think, in fact, some of our guests have had this conversation before, where the question, when interest rates are as low as they are, and a government can borrow at a way longer term than you and I can. We have life limits on that. The question becomes less, can we afford to run some debt and some deficit? Reasonable people can disagree on how much. But if you can afford to borrow, the question becomes less, can we afford it, than which programs should we be picking to do? And it sometimes gets lost in the conversation that we shouldn't be having so much this dogmatic debate about simply should we have a balanced budget and by what time should we have it, and a more focused conversation around what are the programs that best serve productivity in this country? What are the programs that best help drag people out of poverty? You can have those kinds of policy debates around how to spend this money But I think a lot of the oxygen just gets sort of dragged
Right.
into this debate over.
Well, we're going to, I do have to take a commercial break, but when we come back, we're going to dig into some of the specific promises made by each of the individual parties and what they're talking about. Meanwhile, though, we'll also continue to take questions during the break from those of you who have joined us online. So we'll be back with you guys in a few seconds, and we'll be back in a few minutes, with our audience on TV. Stay with us. Hi, everybody. We're here during the commercial break. I'm still with our wonderful guests, Mr. Page, Mr. Ascari, and Mr. Armstrong. Mr. Page, I'll throw you another sort of more general question that we got, and then after we're back from the commercial, we'll dig into some of the details. Who will be taxed the most, Merrick McLeod asks.
So who will be taxed the most? Well, if we look at the individual platforms, the biggest increases in taxes come out of the Green Party platform. They propose to increase tax revenues by actually on an annual increase of as much as 20% in an individual year. So that amounts to like almost $70 billion annually. Heavy taxes go towards the wealthy and in the corporate income taxes. So corporate income taxes under that proposal go up by 6 percentage points, and the wealthy tax, and then a lot of those e-commerce taxes are going to go to wealthy people. So. Who will be taxed the most? It'll be definitely people in that top 10%, top 1% decile.
Who is planning, Mr. Ascari, to spend the most on domestic programs? That's another question we got.
I think most of the spending actually is by all parties would be on domestic programs. I think there are certainly some of the platforms like the Green, for example, there is a plan to increase foreign aid, but most of the other spending, especially by NDP and the Green, will be on domestic programs.
Okay, I have a few seconds left, but we have to wrap this up because we're going to end the commercial break and come back with our TV audience in a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back to Power and Politics. I'm here with some familiar faces to our audience, Mustafa Ascari and Kevin Page from the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy, as well as CBC senior business correspondent Peter Armstrong. We're, of course, taking your questions about each of the parties' platforms and how they intend to pay for their promises, what impact it all could have on the economy. We have just about 9 more minutes, so please post your questions in the comment section alongside this video, on Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, and we're going to try and get to as many of them as possible. Peter, I'm going to pick things up with you. Let's drill into some of the specific questions we're getting on each of the parties' individual platforms. The Conservatives, Canis Lupus 111 asks, where are the billions in cuts coming from? And then he says, who is nailing down Scheer on this question? Mr. Scheer has received a lot of questions.
I think the one that got the most attention, maybe not, it's certainly, it may not be in proportion to how much they're cutting, but the one that got the most attention that jumped out at me was around foreign aid. That they said they were going to be able to save billions of dollars by changing the way we spend money in foreign aid. And I think that got people really, it sparked, I think, one of the most interesting and tough, maybe vitriolic policy disputes in this election. We haven't seen a ton of real meaty policy in this, and this is one of those. And I think it was unfortunate that we didn't get more out of that around what specifically are the programs in foreign aid that we're looking at removing. And I've worked overseas. You've filed from overseas. A lot of those programs in education and in democracy, you can trace back to national security, right? Like we're spending money on education and on healthcare in Afghanistan so people don't get dragged back in to supporting the Taliban, right? Like it can be, it isn't always, but it can be as simple as that. And I think one of the things that, it's been an odd campaign, I think, on stuff like that there hasn't been as much meat on the bone around the debates of what will these actually look like going forward, because we've been talking about, what a minority coalition might look like, rather than some of these like actual policy issues.
The party's argument for doing that is that they want to redistribute where that money goes to. That results in a cut. The metric by which they're judging that, this income sort of scale, is certainly being worthy of debate as well. But that's the argument, at least, that they're putting forward. Mr. Page, Bill Watson asks, where does the NDP propose to get the money to pay for the $27 billion pharmacare program? And I will say the NDP's platform over 5 years allots between $10 and $11 billion each year to pay for pharmacare.
Yeah, so the NDP, again, it's to pay for pharmacare, they have to raise taxes, and so there's, they raise corporate income taxes. They're going to go up by 3 percentage points from current levels. They have a wealth tax, a 2% wealth tax. They have e-commerce tax. A lot of the other parties have e-commerce taxes as well. And I think there's a rollback as well on capital gain taxes. So, yeah, they definitely plan to raise a significant amount of revenues. I think in next year out, it's in the neighborhood of $30 billion, which would be almost unprecedented in my time in terms of revenue generation. But again, if Canadians want programs like pharmacare, and there's some other expensive ticket items, in the NDP platform, that requires a pretty hefty increase in revenues in order to kind of keep the books relatively balanced.
Mr. Ascari, at G. Garner, 68, asks, who besides the so-called wealthiest will be called upon to pay for, and I'll choose liberal, he said NDP Liberal, but for example, Liberal spending plans?
Well, again, I think most of the tax increases will go to the wealthy. So those are the people that will pay for those spending plans. And the Liberals actually have a relatively small programs in general relative to the Greens and NDP. So they don't really need to increase taxes significantly. And also they are essentially using borrowing money to pay for some of those spending programs.
Quinn Beale on Facebook asks, and this sort of jumps off this, Peter, has anyone calculated the savings from pharmacare?
Yeah, I mean, and these guys, I think both Mr. Ascari and Mr. Page have done individual reports looking into that. And, most of them, there was the one done by Eric Hoskins here in Ontario, that looked across the country, but it was done here in Ontario. Most of those sort of balance out and say the cost of doing this will lead to a benefit, that if you can sort of lop all these things together, I think those guys might be able to answer more specifically what the cost savings were. But I think in theory, the idea of a pharmacare plan would cost less than what it would cost us to run it.
Mr. Page, fair comment?
Yeah, absolutely fair comment. And yeah, there are estimates out on those, those savings, what it would mean for a family, what could it mean overall for the Treasury. For the family, it's in several hundreds of dollars. It's billions of dollars potentially if we can implement a program similar to some of these other programs, universal pharmacare programs that exist in Europe. So yeah, but it's again, to get from where we are right now to a universal pharmacare program it's quite a disruptive process. And again, there's not a lot of details fleshed out in the Greens and in the NDP as how they propose to do it. There's been certainly some discussion in recent days, just how tense that conversation could be with the provinces over moving forward on this. But again, I think overall there are savings to be had. We pay too much for drugs in Canada relative to other countries, and we have some pretty significant shortages on coverage as well.
Just to remind our viewers, the NDP and the Greens are both promising single-payer, full universal pharmacare. The Liberals have only allotted $6 billion over 4 years, though the report they commissioned recommended that they initiate the same kind of program. They've allotted $6 billion over 4 years to look into the possibility, and they are promising to sit down with provinces and work something out, though they haven't allotted the kind of money that would pay for it, at least at this point. Mr. Ascari, another question from W. Timbers. What are the plans spending on public transit infrastructure? Is there anything that jumps out at you in the various platforms around infrastructure and public transit funding?
Well, I think both the Green and NDP are planning to increase infrastructure spending. Exactly where those things are going to go is not very clear. The Conservatives obviously are cutting infrastructure spending, or they say they are delaying it and reprofiling that to the future. But those kind of reprofiling and cuts will actually have a significant impact on some of the projects that the municipalities are planning to implement. And so there will be impact. Exactly where those cuts are going to be is not determined by the party. So, but that's a significant cut relative to what the government was planning to spend over the next 4 years.
Peter, just a very simple 2-word question here, but I'd love for you to riff on climate change. So to what degree, and it's a difficult thing to cost out because the plans are all over, there's tons of stuff being proposed. To what degree do you think they've been accurately and fully costed in these various platforms?
Well, a lot of it is unknown. I'll give you the example of, we went to a research firm called Navius and had them punch all of these proposals through into a model to say what impact this would actually have on emissions and what impact that would have on the economy. And one of the proposals we took to them was the Liberal proposal of, I think it's 2 billion trees that they're going to plant. I planted trees when I was in university, so I know a little bit about that. Mm-hmm. And they said they simply couldn't do a proper modeling of it because they don't understand how they do that, where they do it, where they get the land to do it. Like it is a complicated proposal. And frankly, Vassy, that's one of the simple ones, right? So how do you actually factor in, and on the Conservative platform, we had a really hard time figuring out, they eliminate the carbon tax for consumers, but they keep some form of a levy or a cap or we're not even entirely sure what to call it, for big emitters. And how much are they allowed to emit to a certain threshold, and then how much will they have to invest in some kind of a green technology fund after that? And the whole modeling had to make some assumptions that I think they were kind of uncomfortable making because we simply didn't know. So there's a lot of unknowns, and depending on how you game those out and how you model those out, you can come to some pretty dramatically different conclusions about where we end up on emissions and what impact that would have on the economy.
Okay, I unfortunately have to leave it there, but I want to thank all three of you for your insights and expertise this evening. Thank you very much to Peter Armstrong and, of course, Mustafa Ascari and Kevin Page from the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. More Power and Politics right after this.